Could piracy be a solution to piracy? The following will be a take on the current state of piracy in the music industry, pinpointing what in my opinion is right and wrong about it, why, and how could certain aspects be improved. I would like to stress that most of the current work will take an idealistic and conceptual stand on the matter of piracy, and I don't pretend to have definite answers and solutions to the discussed issues. What I can do is comfortably explain why certain aspects need to be tweaked and revamped to accommodate the values of the digital era in which we live in. I'm sure that the solutions and models I will propose will themselves be subject to several different issues. So, let's get straight to the basics. What is piracy? I interviewed Phil Pettibridge, who, among other professional positions, is a managing director of Neon Street, creator of yourmusicbusiness.co.uk, as well as an associate music business lecturer at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. And I asked him just that, to which he replied,
taking something which isn't yours, or you've not paid for it, or you're using it without permission.
which sounds very similar to stealing. However, stealing and pirating are ultimately two similar but very different acts. While the act of stealing something prevents other people from using the stolen good, hence the thief becomes its only owner, the act of piracy doesn't do that. In the late 90s and early 2000s, a now cult anti-piracy advert used to run in cinemas with the catchphrase, "You wouldn't steal a car." The major fallacy in the statement is equating the act of stealing someone's car to de facto duplicating it at zero cost, and thus allowing the original owner of that car to still use it and own it, which is what piracy is all about. Another misconception is that if, say, I illegally download an album that is worth £15 in a music shop, by doing that I am robbing the creator of that album by £15. The fallacy here is that I may have not bought the album in the first place, which means that we have reached a three-scenario situation in which I don't spend £15 for an album and I don't listen to it, which is legal. I don't spend £15 and I do listen to it, which is illegal, and the one in which I do spend £15 and I do listen to it, which is legal. Now, if instead of an album we were talking about a single apple, the second scenario and the only illegal one is the most bizarre as it is paradoxical. I wouldn't spend money for the apple and I would still eat it, but the apple would still be there, which means it's a magical apple that can be eaten an infinite amount of times. World hunger would be solved by such an apple. And no, it wouldn't really be a magical apple, just a digital one. As previously mentioned, it is important to be on par with the current technological advancement. Music, films, photographs, most of the material that used to exclusively exist in its physical form is now a precise sequence of ones and zeros, long strings of code that can be turned into images and sound waves if processed through the right device. And all of it can be duplicated, shared and sent to virtually anyone, anytime, anywhere at an incredibly high speed, which keeps increasing by the year, and this very video is a great example of that. From this point of view, piracy does the exact same thing, and the act of stopping it from happening goes against all that the digital era stands for. Unlike stealing, which is unconditionally disruptive to society and harmful to individuals, the problem of piracy is a financial, economic, and bureaucratic one. Perhaps these facts were not so clear when the first anti-piracy measures were created, as Phil clearly explains.
But you know, it's a funny one because like, piracy, when it first in the concept of sort of digital downloads and streaming, was kind of rapidly made accessible thanks like peer-to-peer file sharing, and the record companies, rather than thinking, oh, okay, people want this stuff, why don't we make a legitimate platform for people to buy it? Let's just stop people from owning what they want to own and let them and try and make them go back to our conventional formats. In a way, you know, music has always been about the people and how they want to engage with it, and if you don't make it available, people will find a way. So back in the early 2000s, record companies were putting copy control onto CDs. They were embedding bits of software onto people's computers when you tried to rip your CD so they could track it. There was watermarking on records. There was all sorts of things. And that mindset wasn't particularly appropriate because it didn't support the consumer in what they wanted to do. I guess the most mainstream way of accessing, making digital music available was when iTunes first created. So Apple created iTunes, I should say, it's the other way around, and they actually said, you know, hey, here's the music that you want, and you can buy it and own it properly, and it's all nice and high quality, and there's no legitimate issues around it, and it kind of went from there. So I don't think the people who own the recordings, which is the record labels, went about it in the right way to start with, but now they've kind of realised, oh yeah, actually we need to make our content available in ways that people want. Then people then start engaging with it. It's not particularly on reflection, it's not particularly rocket science, but at the time, I think there was very much a case of we don't like change, so therefore we're going to stop people doing what they want to do. So I think in the past it hasn't worked, but now people are starting to sort of get their heads around the fact that you have to adapt to how people want to engage with media.
The main and biggest problem that I see with the state of today's music industry is that there is a price for music. On iTunes, for example, songs cost a certain amount of money, and if a user pays for it, they can download and listen to the song. It has been that way for years, and I believe that it is fundamentally wrong because there are no costs for duplication and distribution for that individual music file. The price exists because there is an artist who composed that song, put hours of work into it, and expects to make a living out of their profession. Hence, they want to sell their product. However, as long as their income allows them to live an ordinary life in which they can carry on their profession, they shouldn't care where their income comes from. So, in order for us to be consistent with the digitalism of our era, we should find a way to both allow free distribution of digital material and adequately support the creators of said digital material. A viable alternative to this would be a revenue based on a number of playbacks of an artist's track rather than its sales. This is what a streaming platform like Spotify already does. However, while it is quite cheap to pay £10 a month in exchange for most of the music in the world, the single artist's revenue off of it is consequently low as well. On this matter, this is what Phil had to say.
It's like when they first launched digital downloads. Originally, the price was set by iTunes, which is 79p, and everyone kind of went with that, thinking, "Oh, that seems like quite a good price." But on reflection, maybe the price was set too low, maybe the price was set too high. Then suddenly we go into streaming, and Spotify set the price at tenner. Maybe that's too cheap, because if you look at the royalties that people are getting from Spotify, that doesn't really represent a good return for the creator if they're earning 0.0036 of a penny.
Which leads to a rather simple question. Wouldn't it be enough for artists on Spotify to be paid more than what they are? Considering a model in which iTunes and all its derivatives don't exist, could there be enough resources to adequately retribute artists solely based on the playback rates of their products? On par with Spotify, another platform has risen to established status over the past few years, and that is Patreon. On Patreon, users can arbitrarily choose how and how much they are willing to support creators of their choice. Again, the money here goes directly to the artist, and it is not used to purchase their creations, as Phil also states.
I mean, there's platforms like Patreon where you can actually support the individual rather than the art, like you said, and you fund them in a sustainable way. And if someone feels that passionate about the creator, that's fine. But I guess in a society which we've got so much art and music to engage with, we pick and choose the content versus the creator. There's not that allegiance, if that makes sense. But maybe that's what needs to change. Individuals need to build relationships with the customers for long-term game, and that does happen with some people. But the amount of people that get that, it doesn't always make it sustainable for everyone.
And ultimately, as it is happening in our current model, a big chunk of the musician's revenue is represented by the merchandise sales and live performances. So to sum everything up, if the sale of music as we know it were to be stripped off, there would be three remaining sources of income for musicians. Spotify with drastically increased playback rates, Patreon as it is now, and live concerts and merchandise sales. Could a model like this work? I do not have the knowledge nor the competencies to answer that question. What I can do is to try and apply the same methodology I used to break down the current model to this alternative model. The most straightforward issue with playback rates would be that artists could set up playback bots or fake accounts that would continuously listen to their products, hence creating income out of thin air. Certain IT regulations, however, could solve this problem. A more compelling issue here would be the one dealing with copyright and ownership, as music would be free. Among the aspects that I feel is wrong in today's society, I initially left out copyright as it is a topic far wider than this video would allow. However, from an exclusively artistic and creative point of view, I don't think that copyright should exist. That is to say, I believe every musician should be free to reuse any material any other musician has created in the past, as long as the original creators are credited. In other words, no creator should be allowed to deny the use of their own work, as long as the resulting work is not problematic for reasons external than those related to music. i.e., political propaganda or social issues, in which case the original artist should be allowed to dispute the rights for the material to be used, in a similar fashion to what happens today in copyright cases. I would like to make one last digression on the topic of virtual instruments. These are software that composers widely use today to compose and produce music. The price of a single virtual instrument can range from tens to thousands of pounds, and, unsurprisingly, they too are subject to piracy for economic reasons. The price, of course, is decided based on how much it costed to create the virtual instrument in the first place, how many copies of it are expected to be sold, etc. However, at the end of the day, as similarly as with music, the final product, the virtual instrument itself, is nothing more than a very long line of code, which can be copied and pasted for free, infinitely. However, in this case, dissimilarly to music, a virtual instrument is an extremely powerful resource for any modern composer. Finalizing one and then deciding to set a price on it is like discovering an infinite source of drinkable water and then asking £1 per liter. If something like this happened in the real world, the backlash for how morally wrong such an act is would be tremendous. So why shouldn't it be just as bad when it comes to music or all other arts? In conclusion, the proposed alternative model would conceptually be more adapted and in line with the increasingly digital world we are part of. It would, however, require a measure as drastic as the complete elimination of the purchase of music for it to work, which is an extreme and perhaps revolutionary action. In addition, a complete revision would also be necessary when it comes to how music is funded by the government. As stated in the premise, designing a perfect model for such a complex structure is ambitious. I do hope, however, that I have exhaustingly exposed some of the evident flaws in the current state of the music industry.